morning. Pastor Rick is visiting family in Florida. He's seeing that new grandbaby of his. So, because he's out of town, I get the honor and the absolute privilege to bring the message this morning. So I'm excited as all get out to look out and see so many people here, because quite honestly, the last time that I gave the message, the live stream team and Pastor Rick was the only ones in the building. So, it's I'm just excited that people are able to come back out, and I'm just really happy to see everybody here this morning. Well, in his book, Where is God When It Hurts?, Philip Yancey tells the story of Brian Sternberg. Brian was a nationally acclaimed track star, and he held several records in the pole vault competition. During the 1963 season, when Brian was 19 years old, he had unbelievable success. He made sports headlines almost every single week. He remained undefeated in outdoor competition, and he set his first world record. Excitement and thrills absolutely filled the spring and the summer for the Sternbergs. Then 3 weeks after Brian set his second world record, everything changed for him. On July 2nd, 1963, while working out on the trampoline in preparation for the U.S. track team's tour of Russia, Brian landed on his neck. There was a crack, and all feeling and movement in his arms and legs was absolutely gone. Now, Brian Sternberg was a Christian, and he had a lot of faith, and that faith was put to the test. He faced a crisis that threatened to leave him with quadriplegia for the rest of his life. Now, Brian had faith that God could and would heal his paralysis. But Brian never did experience the healing that he so often prayed for. He remained paralyzed right up until the time that he died at the age of 69 in 2013. So does this mean that Brian didn't have enough faith? Does this mean that God let him down? Does this mean that God simply chose to walk away from Brian in his time of need? Well, less than a year after the accident, Brian was asked to write an article for Look magazine. He ended with these very powerful words that describe a biblical view of faith. He said, having faith is a necessary step towards one of two things. Being healed is one of them. Peace of mind, if that healing does not come, is the other. Either one is fine with me. Now, Philip Yancey then went to visit Brian about 10 years after the accident, and everything had changed. Well-meaning Christians had convinced Brian that since God loved him, God wanted him to walk again. They convinced him that he could stand up and he would walk away from his wheelchair if he would only have enough faith. In Brian's mind, faith now meant that there were no longer two options, but only one. And that was complete healing. Only full recovery and healing would suffice. Brian began not putting his faith in God, but now he was putting his faith in faith. Some people were amazed at the great faith of this young man who still said that God would heal him. Others said that he lacked faith, or God would have already healed him. Yet the fact remained that when Philip Yancey left the house of Brian Sternberg that day, he sensed there was a mood of an uncompleted, uncomfortable struggle mixed with tough, undying faith. As Brian struggled to find enough human faith, he forgot that God is sovereign and lost his peace of mind. We're going to be discussing Daniel 3 this morning, and Daniel 3 teaches us that because God is sovereign, we must put our faith in Him as we stand before the fire. This historical narrative gives us a glimpse of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and their faith, illustrating two types of biblical faith. The first is faith is obedience to God's sovereign commands. Second, faith is trust in God's sovereign will. Biblical faith will always enable us to stand firm when we stand before the fiery trials. As Daniel 3 begins, we find that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up a golden statue in the plain of Dura. So if you would join with me, if you have a device or a Bible, or if you want to join me on the screen, we're going to be reading in Daniel 3. And it starts by saying, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image out of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather together the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of all the province to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province gathered together, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace." So, reading that, we find out that basically every important guy in Babylon was here, had come in for this, and apparently they had brought all their instruments because there was a lot of different instruments. And the whole point is that King Nebuchadnezzar set up this golden statue, and it's not really, the text doesn't really tell us if it's a statue depicting King Nebuchadnezzar or if it's a statue representing one of the Babylonian gods. But either way, it's 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, which, if you're not familiar with biblical math, which, not people are, that translates to about 90 feet high and about 9 feet wide. So let's just say if this was meant to be a replication of King Nebuchadnezzar himself, it likely wasn't a very flattering one. I mean, unless he was really tall and really thin. So, either way, a decree went out across the land indicating that upon the playing of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, blah, 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 everyone was supposed to immediately stop what they were doing, bow themselves low to the ground, and worship this statue. Should anyone decide to not follow this decree, King Nebuchadnezzar had set up this nice burning furnace, and he said, "If you don't listen to me, in you go." I mean, if that doesn't inspire submission, I don't know what will. But we find out in verse 7 that as the time arrives to test the decree and the music begins to play, it appears that everyone obeys the order and worships the statue. For many people who were present, it was nothing at all. It meant nothing at all to obey this decree. The pagans had no convictions. They simply just did what they were told and didn't care about the consequences. Most people in our day could care less that our culture is growing increasingly immoral. They don't care that Jesus is blasphemed and God is expelled from our society on a regular basis. They have no motivation at all to take a stand when our freedoms are taken away. They are quick to call Christians both bigots and judgmental if we dare to take a stand for Christ. They reject the gospel and they reject Christ. And as a result, they will mock, scorn, and persecute people that follow Christ. This was the case for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even though most people bowed and worshiped the idol, it did not change the fact that for them at least, God was still God. And we can rest in the fact that even though most of society might reject him, it doesn't change the fact that for us, God is still God. In this vast multitude that worshiped the golden idol, there were only 3 that dared take a stand for God. Things are no different today. Though there may be many who profess to follow Christ, how many of us are really, truly willing to take that stand when it really means something serious? So there's a question that I want to examine this morning as we go through this chapter of Daniel 3, and that is, what does faith in the furnace actually look like? Well, I would argue that first, this type of faith stands up to public ridicule. In verse 8, there's a group of Chaldeans that are basically astrologers that decide to get these 3 Jewish boys into trouble out of professional jealousy. They immediately go to the king and play off of his vanity, reminding the king about all of the edict's details and pointing out that there were certain Jews that did not obey the command. We discover that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had quietly disobeyed the command and not worshiped the statue. This simple act went completely unnoticed almost by everyone except this small group of Chaldeans. And it's interesting for me to look at that and say, well, if this group of Chaldeans was bowed low to the ground and worshiping the statue like they were supposed to, how do they know what Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were doing? So in the story, it's, the king kind of misses that point that, if they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, they wouldn't have known what everybody else was doing. But I want you to notice that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not make a big show out of their refusal to obey the command. No, they just quietly and simply, unassumingly, just stood there. However, because these Chaldeans went to the king, there was a real hornet's nest that was kicked up against them. So here, after their accusers have brought them forward and have revealed that they didn't worship the image, Nebuchadnezzar flies into a furious rage and asks them if it's true that they will not worship the image. I like what these 3 Hebrew boys, and you're going to hear me refer to them as boys, because what you've got to realize is that when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken from Israel to Babylon, they were all about the ripe old age of about 12, maybe 13. This is just a few years later. So these guys are now maybe 16, 17, 18 years old. And some people point out that, when we read this story, the only people that we see are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We don't learn anything about Daniel in this story. Well, maybe Daniel was in another part of the kingdom doing work for Nebuchadnezzar when this took place. Maybe he had won an all-expense-paid trip to the Bahamas. Daniel, for whatever reason, just was not there. It does not mean that, Daniel went along with the decree and bowed himself and worshiped the idol. No, Daniel just was not here at the time. But we see that when confronted, these 3 Hebrew boys immediately begin to stand on the principles that they had learned and been taught. And that speaks to us today as believers, and it tells us that we have to stand on the Word of God. When the pressures of the world come our way, it's not time for us to do as those that have no hope and just simply give up. No, it's about us taking God at His word and standing on His promises. So our first principle was that faith, this type of faith, stands up to public ridicule. Our second point is that this type of faith stands firm when everyone else around you is backing down. Hear me now. It takes a lot of courage to not compromise. And I want you to understand that this type of courage isn't something that you just kind of come into at the moment. No, your mind needs to be made up well before the crisis comes. If you want to make up your mind in the moment, you're likely to fail. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had made this type of faith, this type of determination into a lifestyle throughout their time in Babylon so far. Notice in verse 14 that King Nebuchadnezzar once again asks them if it's true. Verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every other kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well, good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" So King Nebuchadnezzar isn't just automatically taking the word of this group of Chaldeans. He's saying, hey guys, is this actually true? Are you really not following my decree? Are you really not bowing down to this statue that I've set up? If you look back over the first 2 chapters of the book of Daniel, you will see that King Nebuchadnezzar had grown to have a genuine appreciation for these 3 boys in Daniel. I believe that the king honestly, genuinely wanted this to be a false accusation so that he wouldn't have to punish them. Once he determines that they have refused to bow down, he now seeks to give them a second chance. And he says, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the music playing, just bow down and everything will be fine. But then he reissues the ultimatum. Don't forget that fiery furnace out there. Because if you continue to refuse to bow down to the statue, you're going to get hot. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego needed only to join the crowd and submit to the king. Nebuchadnezzar didn't care whether or not their worship was authentic. He was more interested in their submission. They could be as angry and upset and as objecting as hard as they wanted to on the inside, as long as what showed up on the outside was them bowed to the ground and appearing to worship the idol. Notice at the end of verse 15 that Nebuchadnezzar once again mocks God by asking the 3, "Who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" For these 3 Jewish teenagers, this question had long been settled. If challenged to worship an idol of the God or the God of heaven, the answer is simple. In the words of Joshua 24:15, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Since first arriving in Babylon around the age of 13, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had consistently lived in a way that went against cultural norms. As a result, God had blessed them repeatedly and caused them and Daniel to prosper under the king. Now it would be no different. They had complete confidence in God's power and God's purpose. God's servants must trust in God's power and protection and leave what happens next in God's hands to be decided by His providential plan. Please note in verse 16 that the three are respectful when they address the king. Despite what our culture tells us today, we don't need to be disrespectful, rude, or condescending when disagreeing with those in authority. Our protests don't need to be violent. We just need to simply state our case, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did, and trust that God's will is going to be done, and if need be, that God will protect us. Far too often when people today disagree, it ends in name-calling, violence, or some kind of a fiery protest. We can take a page from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and not overthink what we're going through. Immediately after being challenged by Nebuchadnezzar, the three Jewish teens give their response. They don't need time to think it over. They said, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we need no time. We have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." They gave this answer immediately. They didn't need time to think it over. They didn't ask for time to consider their options or pray and ask God for counsel. Even the great Martin Luther asked for a night to think and pray when the Pope asked him to recant. There are times in your life when you don't want to take time to debate the pros and cons of an issue. If you do, you might likely choose the wrong position. There are times when you have to respond correctly and you have to do the right thing instantly, or you might fail the test. What if Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had listened to our kinds of rationalizations? Someone might have pulled these three aside and said, "Look, the three of you are clearly sincere and dedicated. Honestly, we need more people like you. Which is why you have to listen to reason in this matter. Because if you don't listen and instead persist in this obstinate disobedience, you're going to be killed. And then your beneficial influence is going to be over. So consider that your disobedience is actually already being entirely misunderstood because you think that you're standing up for God and the identity of the one true God of heaven, but what you're actually doing is being observed as civil disobedience. And you're just being defiant of the king's order. You're not going to be executed because of your religious beliefs. No, guys, you're going to be executed because of civil disobedience. So, honestly, guys, what good does your persisting in this rebellious state do? Guys, just bow down. Just worship the idol this one time and live and extend your godly influence in other ways. Or maybe some extremely wise person, a wise friend would have said, "Hey, guys, you need to understand that Nebuchadnezzar is actually on your side. He didn't need to give you a hearing. When he did, he certainly didn't need to give you another chance. He's done these things simply because he already likes you guys. He doesn't want to execute you. And I think that maybe if you just kind of stand way off at a distance, and when the music plays, if you simply just kind of close your eyes and bow your head a little bit, that'll probably suffice. Maybe the king doesn't need you to really get to the ground and worship the idol." It takes men of courage to make a compromise like that. If Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had stopped to consider arguments like this, they might have wavered. But they didn't stop to consider them, and they didn't waver because they already knew, they had already determined where they stand. In other words, they had already wrestled through such issues and knew that whatever else they might have been, they were first and foremost worshipers of the one true God of heaven. God said in the Ten Commandments, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no gold, make for yourself you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness or anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." Exodus 20, verses 3 through 6. So far we've seen that faith in the furnace stands up to public ridicule, and we've seen that faith in the furnace stands firm when everyone else is backing down. Now we see that faith in the furnace knows and understands what God is capable of doing. They proclaimed that God had the power to deliver them. But even if He chose not to, they still weren't going to bow down. These men were not fair weather followers of God. They didn't just follow Him when things were easy and going their way. They were willing to follow God even if it cost them their lives. But what I want you to take away from this is the confidence that they had in God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not know the future. They had not been promised that they weren't going to suffer or they weren't going to die in the furnace. They were willing to die for their convictions. This is important because it's possible to believe in a sovereign God and know from Scripture that God, that sovereign God, requires, and yet sometimes we fail to do the right thing because we're just not willing to pay the price of obedience. Not many of us are likely to ever be faced with the choice of obedience or persecution, compromise or execution. I hope and pray that none of us ever face that choice. Many people fail because they're just not willing to pay the price of lost popularity or loneliness or public ridicule or persecution or even economic hardship. Only those that are willing to pay such prices make a difference. Dr. Josef Tson, I think I'm saying that right, was a Romanian pastor who before his exile was called before the communist authorities to answer for his religious convictions and preaching. He expected to be killed. He set his affairs in order, and when he appeared before the interrogating officers, he stopped him and he said, "I have to tell you that first and foremost, I am ready to die. I've put my affairs in order because your supreme weapon is killing, and my supreme weapon is dying." You see, because if you kill me, people all over Romania will read my books and believe in the God that I preach, even more than they do now. The interrogator simply looked at Pastor Son and said, "Who said anything about killing you?" And after a while, he let him go. Next, we discover that faith in the furnace knows that God will not always bring a miraculous deliverance for His people. This is a tough one. God's not always going to deliver you. God's not always going to take away your pain and make it easier for you. He certainly didn't for Brian Sternberg. The Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians 1:21 that for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. God will always be there to give His grace to His people in their time of need. As the psalmist says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. But what about those that aren't miraculously delivered? What about Brian Sternberg? Well, Hebrews 11 tells us that some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, and of them the world was not worthy. Hebrews 11:35 through 38. Some question the love of a God that would put His people in a position to make such a difficult choice of obeying sovereign commands while standing before the fire, or making them trust in His sovereign abilities while facing such horrible troubles in life and trials. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted that God was sovereign and refused to worship anyone else. We know the outcome of this story. Nebuchadnezzar was absolutely furious that the three Jewish young men would not obey him. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. You know, just in case the God of these 3 Hebrew boys was actually able to put out a normal fire furnace. The flames were superheated to the point that the men that took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up to throw them into the fire were themselves killed by the heat. Instead, when Nebuchadnezzar looked into the furnace to see what was going on, he didn't see 3 guys in there that were being burned alive. No, he saw them walking around freely, unbound and unharmed, and he saw a 4th person among them who, quote, looked like a son of the gods in Daniel 3:25. I want you to know this today. God was entirely able to put the fire out. That would have been nothing for God. But what would have resulted instead? Well, Nebuchadnezzar probably would have just had the fire relit, and he would have been even more angry and defiant. No, God did something that was even more miraculous than just putting the fire out. And this is what's really important for us to realize about our own troubling situations in life, our own pain and trials. God didn't put the fire out. God got in there with them. Lori's favorite poem, my wife Lori's favorite poem, is Footprints in the Sand. And if you're familiar with the poem, you'll know that sometimes our lives get so difficult that God no longer walks beside us, but instead He picks us up, He holds us close, and He carries us through our most troubling times, our most challenging times. It's not difficult to know who that 4th person was. He was Jesus Christ in a pre-incarnate form. Perhaps the form that He had when He appeared to Abraham before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Or maybe it was the same form that He had when He wrestled with Jacob beside the brook Jabbok. This is a vivid portrayal of the fact that God stands with His people in the midst of their trouble. So our last point this morning is that this type of faith, this type of fiery faith, understands that sometimes the trials and the troubles that we're going through are actually meant to point someone else to God. That God allows us to suffer in order to point someone else around us to Him. If we look together at verses 26 through 28 of chapter 3, we see that Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over them or their bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. The men were released from the furnace, and not a single hair on their head was damaged. The only thing that got burned up in that fire was the ropes that they had been bound with. These guys didn't smell like smoke and fire. They smelled like they'd just gotten out of the shower. This is one of those stories in the Bible that's just simply amazing. But can I tell you something? If these men had died in the flames that day, it still doesn't change the fact that God is still God and God is still in charge. Nothing changes that fact. You may be facing a time of uncertainty in your life. You may be in the midst of a fiery trial yourself, like you've never experienced before. You may encounter persecution that you've never expected. Regardless of your circumstances, understand that God is still God. I know that many of you are in the midst of the fire right now. Maybe you question if God is even still there and if He still cares for you. If so, I would encourage you to listen and reflect on the words of Peter in 1 Peter 4:12. When he says, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. Ultimately, God was using His power through the faithful courage of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to point Nebuchadnezzar back to God. He wanted King Nebuchadnezzar to understand that he is actually the one true God. And that Nebuchadnezzar wasn't divine. These Babylonian gods didn't mean anything. Just as God allowed Job to be put through the most difficult circumstances that anyone could ever possibly imagine, simply to prove to Satan that Job wouldn't give in. He uses the circumstances of these three Jewish teens to teach Nebuchadnezzar a vivid lesson. Sometimes God allows us to experience trial by fire so that we can be refined and use our story to point others to Him. See, in the Bible, fire is only ever used in two ways: judgment and refinement. So God is either going to bring fire into our lives to judge us in some way or to make us better. God certainly wasn't judging Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He was refining them. He was making them better. He was making them more pure. So consider the story of a Christian miner as we close this morning. This Christian miner was injured at a young age and became an invalid who spent his time watching through a window from his bed as life passed him by. He watched as men his age prospered, raised families, and he watched as their grandchildren grew up. And he watched as his body withered, his house crumbled, and his life wasted away. One day, while the bedridden miner was quite old, a younger man came to visit him and said, I hear that you believe in God and that you claim that He loves you. How can you believe such things after all that has happened to you in life? Don't you sometimes have doubts about God and His love? The old man hesitated and he smiled. And he said, yes, it's true. Sometimes Satan comes calling on me in this fallen down house of mine. He sits right there by my bed where you're sitting now. He points out my window to the men that I once worked with who are still young, active, and vibrant. And he says, does Jesus really love you? And Satan casts a jeering glance around my tattered room and around my crumbling down house, and he points it to the fine homes of my friends across the street, and he asks, does Jesus really love you? Then at last, Satan points to the grandchild of a dear friend of mine, a man who has everything that I do not, and Satan waits for that tear to enter my eye, and he whispers, does Jesus really love you? And what do you say when Satan speaks to you that way? Asked the young man. The old miner said, well, at that point I simply take Satan by the hand and I lead him off into my mind to a hill far away called Calvary. There I look up and point to the thorn-tortured brow, the nail-pierced hands and feet, and the spear-wounded side. And I ask Satan, Satan, you tell me, how much does Jesus love me? As we go through the fiery trials of life and it seems that there is no good way out, please know and understand that faith in the furnace never gives up on God, because God will never give up on you. Let's pray together. Gracious Father in heaven, I just thank you so much for once again being able to preach this morning. And God, I just ask that as we consider the words of Daniel 3, and as we consider what it means to have this type of faith that stands up to the fiery trials of life, God, I just ask that you would help us to stand firm when we're tested the most. And I ask that you would help us to stand firm in our knowledge that you're in control and that you love us. And that even if our life doesn't ultimately get better, that we still have you. And that we can someday look forward to an eternity in you where we don't have the pain and the trials of life anymore. So God, I just ask now that you would just bless our time of worship together. And I commit the rest of our service to you now. And I pray all this in your name. Amen.